Narcissists control everyone they meet until they meet this one type of person. There is a pattern most people fail to recognize early when dealing with narcissistic behavior in relationships. At the beginning, they often appear extremely charming, confident, and emotionally magnetic in a way that feels almost undeniable. They carefully observe your emotional reactions, slowly learning what gains your attention and what earns your compliance over time. Without you realizing it, they begin shaping the emotional environment in subtle ways that gradually revolve around their needs and desires. Compliments start feeling strategic, attention becomes conditional, and emotional warmth begins depending on your level of agreement. Before you notice the shift, you are no longer acting freely, but instead responding to their emotional cues almost automatically. They reinforce compliance by rewarding agreement and withdrawing connection the moment you express independence or emotional resistance. This is how control is built in psychological terms, not through force, but through repeated emotional reinforcement and conditioning. Most people slowly adapt to this dynamic, trying harder to regain approval, connection, and emotional stability from the same person. That adaptation becomes the foundation of the narcissist's control system, where emotional dependence replaces natural self-expression over time. They rarely dominate through open aggression, but instead maintain influence through emotional unpredictability and subtle psychological leverage. However, there is one specific type of person who completely disrupts this entire control structure from the very beginning of interaction, not by arguing louder, not by exposing them, and not by trying to win psychological battles through direct confrontation or resistance, but by simply refusing to participate in the emotional game that the narcissist depends on to maintain influence and control. This person is emotionally anchored, meaning their sense of identity does not fluctuate based on external approval or emotional reactions. They do not require validation from others to feel stable, grounded, or secure in their own thoughts and emotional reality. And that internal stability is something that narcissistic control systems struggle to penetrate or destabilize effectively over time. Because control always requires emotional hooks, and this type of person does not offer those hooks for manipulation to attach to. When manipulation is met with calm neutrality instead of emotional reaction, it loses direction and gradually loses psychological effectiveness. When emotional pressure is met with silence or grounded responses, it loses its intended impact and begins to collapse internally. The narcissist slowly begins to experience something unfamiliar in these interactions, which is the absence of predictable emotional outcomes. Their usual patterns stop working because there is no emotional escalation, no desperation, and no reactive behavior to influence. Complaints, charm, guilt, or provocation no longer shift the emotional center of this person in any predictable or useful direction. Instead of emotional engagement, they are met with calm observation, steady boundaries, and a noticeable lack of emotional dependency. Instead of escalation or resistance, they are met with emotional neutrality that cannot be easily manipulated or redirected. This creates deep confusion inside the narcissist's mindset because their entire psychological strategy depends on emotional responsiveness from others. They expect resistance, emotional reactivity, or attempts to fix or repair the relationship under pressure or emotional discomfort. But this person offers none of those predictable responses, which slowly dismantles the effectiveness of their control-based strategies. They do not rush to defend themselves emotionally, nor do they over-explain their boundaries to regain approval or validation. They simply remain steady, emotionally consistent, and internally grounded even when pressure or manipulation is repeatedly applied. And this consistency begins to quietly weaken the narcissist's influence without any direct confrontation or visible conflict. The narcissist then begins testing harder, using different emotional strategies to regain the predictable responses they are used to. They may increase charm, withdraw affection, create confusion, or even escalate emotional tension to provoke some kind of reaction. But every attempt produces the same result, which is emotional neutrality and a complete lack of psychological leverage over this person. This is where frustration slowly replaces confidence, because control without response eventually loses meaning and emotional purpose. They begin to realize, often unconsciously, that this person cannot be easily shaped, redirected, or emotionally destabilized like others. And that realization creates discomfort. because it challenges their internal belief that they can influence emotional dynamics at will. At this stage, something begins to shift inside their mindset, where admiration, frustration, and confusion start to merge together. They no longer feel like they are guiding the emotional interaction, but instead feel like they are facing something immovable and unshakable. This is where their behavior often becomes more intense, not because they are succeeding, but because they are losing emotional control. The more stable this person remains, the more unstable the narcissist begins to feel internally during every interaction. The more silence or neutrality they encounter, the more pressure they feel to regain some form of emotional influence or reaction. Eventually, they are forced into a psychological crossroads where they must either adapt or withdraw from the interaction completely, because their usual control mechanisms no longer produce predictable outcomes or emotional responses they can rely on. This becomes the hidden breaking point that most people never recognize, because it does not look like conflict or confrontation. Instead, it appears as silent loss of dominance, where influence slowly dissolves without dramatic emotional explosions or visible breakdowns. And this only happens with people who refuse to abandon themselves emotionally, even under pressure or psychological manipulation. People who do not chase validation, do not argue for approval, and do not sacrifice their emotional stability for temporary connection. They simply remain grounded in their truth, regardless of emotional pressure, manipulation attempts, or psychological discomfort from others. That is the one type of person narcissistic control struggles to survive against over time in any consistent or meaningful way. Not perfect people, not aggressive people, but emotionally unshakable individuals who do not participate in the control dynamic at all. Because in the end, control only exists where emotional dependence is present and continuously reinforced over time. And where emotional dependence disappears completely, control slowly dissolves on its own without needing any confrontation at all.